Thanks for being with us on Africa 24 for another edition of the interview. Today with Omar Alieu TOURAY, President of the Ecowas Commission, we will discuss economic challenges in the Ecowas region. Mr. Alieu TOURAY, welcome to Africa 24.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's go into the matter. The theme of the 2024 AFDB annual meeting is Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. In your opinion, what are the challenges for the continent and more specifically for the Ecowas sub-region in terms of renewable energies, fight against food insecurity, and the regional integration?
Well, first I would like to use this platform to congratulate the African Development Bank for organizing a good and a very successful 59th annual meeting. And I congratulate them in advance on the 60th anniversary of the African Development Bank. I think the theme of the year is pertinent, Africa's transformation, and that would require re-engineering of international financial infrastructure. As you have heard from various presenters, we do require a lot of transformation of the financial infrastructure or the global financial system to be able to transform Africa. And I think this is essential because A, Africa does not have sufficient resources, and then the resources that come to Africa are not at the most favorable terms. And I think it is good for African Development Bank to lead the continent in the fight for the transformation of the global financial infrastructure. We in Africa, as many presenters and many speakers indicated since yesterday, we are not looking for charity as such, but we are looking for an equitable and a fair financial system that will take into consideration the constraints that the continent faces. And I do hope and I'm confident that it may take some time, but our partners will listen to us.
Now, what do you think about regional integration? How can ECOWAS be part of this project of reforming the financial architecture of the continent?
I think regional integration, that is our core business as ECOWAS. And we try to do this through a number of measures. One is to boost intra-community trade and integrate the factors of production. Factors of production here meaning capital as well as labor. And means of trade, means of regional integration. And by this, I'm talking about the infrastructure that is required. So if we all look at a region like ours, our intra-community trade is very low. It is about 12%. And we cannot talk about an integrated region when intra-community trade remains so low. If you look at statistics, you will realize that regions that are fully or highly integrated trade among themselves to the tune of 60%. ASEAN countries, their intra-community trade is around there. European Union, their intra-community trade is around 70%. So we in Africa, particularly in West Africa, with 12% intra-community trade, we have a long way to go. And we need to work on this. To do this, we need to work on a number of areas. A, we have to build on our capacity to produce. The supply constraints need to be addressed, and this is where financing is important because you need to invest to be able to trade. So that production, to be able to produce and trade. So that investment is required. B, we need to work on our infrastructure. It is very expensive moving from one point to another point in our region. You must have heard this. Sometimes it might be cheaper to get consignment from outside the continent to a port in the continent, on the continent, than from one port of the continent to another port. So this is because there is infrastructure deficit. And again, this brings us to the theme of the subject, that is a more fair financial system, because to build the infrastructure, we would need a lot of investment. And the investment cannot be enhanced if the cost of borrowing remains very high. As you know, the African Development Bank is the only AAA rated bank on the continent, but other financial institutions are there. They should be able to support us. But if they access expensive resources, then their own lending would be very expensive. So this is another area where we need to work on, that is infrastructure. And a whole host of areas that we need to improve on. Movement of people. We in Ecowas, we have achieved this in a big way, but we have a long way to go. And we feel that we should be able to allow our people to have free movement in real sense. Of course, our protocols allow for free movement, but in real sense, there are still some room for improvement, and I hope we will be able to do this.
You mentioned something about fair financing. Africa will need around $30,000 billion a year to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Sari, where do you think African countries should get the funds they need to achieve these goals while the continent is going through a lot of political crisis?
Well, first, we need to have stability. This is why, for us in ECOWAS, we are working very hard to address insecurity. The funds that we require to attain the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal don't have to come from outside. We do have them in our own countries. We have resources that can be exploited, but that requires stability. It requires a lot of stability. We also need to get governance right. I think this is why you see regional economic communities putting a lot of emphasis on security, on stability, on governance, because without these, you can be sitting on resources that would be of no use to you. So I think we need to stabilize first so that we can get the confidence of investors as well. Because some of these resources, as I said, would have to come in the form of investment. Investors don't like instability. And that would continue to disadvantage Africa, and we need to see how best we can address this issue. I think funding also should come in a big way, and this is what the African Development Bank theme is all about: scaled financing as well as cheaper financing. So I think with all that, if we can attain these objectives, we should be able to get very close to the 2030 development goals.
All right. So now, Africa grew by an average of 4.3% between the 2000 and 2022, outpacing the global average of 2.9% over the same period. However, the underlying structure of African economies has not significantly changed. What could explain the situation in your opinion?
Well, yes, growth rate of African countries has been on average, I can say above global average. But then we need to look at the drivers of those growth, and that growth in particular. I mean, most of it, or some of it, a good chunk of it comes from the extractive industry. How inclusive is that growth? And I think the challenge is there. We must make sure growth is inclusive. Growth trickles down to the average person. That way, we can all benefit from the growth of our economies. But other than that, we will be registering impressive growth figures, but poverty will remain. So in my view, one of the solutions is to ensure that our growth is inclusive. And we should target areas, we should invest in areas that really provide proper employment for our people. That areas that provide food security for our people. And by that I mean agriculture. We need to invest heavily in agriculture to be able to provide employment to for our people, as well as provide food security. If we do that, we're not going to address unemployment and food security alone. We're going to address security as a whole. Because as you know, some of these insecurity insecurity issues we have in, let's say, West Africa, most of it is driven by perhaps poverty. Poverty is a key driver. Some of these young people join armed groups, according to expert studies, not because of religious conviction or because of political conviction, just because they are looking for a job. So I think these are some of the areas we need to focus on.
Well, we have anticipated a bit on the next question, but I want us to come back on the issues of food security. Some experts believe that the sectoral composition of economic growth and employment in Africa has not changed since the 1990s, with agriculture still accounting for almost half of Africa's total workforce, notably in countries like Burkina Faso, Nigeria, or even Mali, making them vulnerable to the volatility of oil prices and external shocks. How can this situation be remedied?
I think certainly our economies, as I have indicated, we have been growing, but perhaps the growth has not been inclusive. To remedy some of these things, we might have to focus a lot on resilience. Resilience is an important area that can help us resist or face external shocks that we invariably encounter. And I think by this, we need to focus on climate action. Adaptation is very important in the African context. And to be able to do this, we must have access to climate finance. You must have seen this. I mean, we contribute nothing more than 5% of global warming or what have you. But then we receive only 5% of climate finance. And we need no. I mean, we receive only 5% of that when the impact on us is much higher than any other region. So that equity needs to be established. And I think the resilience would come through this sort of investment. Climate action, adaptation for Africa to ensure that we can face the shocks that come from outside.
Okay, now let's talk a bit about the debt. With more than 25 countries in debt distress or higher risk of debt distress, and with interest rates that are still very high, leading us to continue dependence on external resources for development, it brings major challenges. Against this backdrop, what are the urgent reforms that African institutions and decision makers have to undertake in order to finance their economies themselves?
Well, I think a number of things would have to be done. We need to be producing sufficiently. African countries need to invest in the productive sectors of their economies to be able to grow in a more inclusive manner. And to address the debt situation, we need to be able to grow, to produce, and trade in an equitable manner. For now, it is very difficult. We find ourselves in a structure which makes it easier for a country like Senegal to import beef or dairy products from Holland than from Mali, next door. That is because of the global structure that happens to be unfair with Africa.
Okay, please let's now talk about debt. With more than 25 countries in debt distress or high risk of debt distress, with interest rates that are really high, we continue to be dependent on external resources for development. Against this backdrop, in your opinion, what are the urgent reforms that African institutions and decision makers need to undertake in order to finance their economies by themselves?
Well, I think first, to address the debt situation, we need to have access to concessional resources. That's one. If concessional resources are matched with grants, that's one way of addressing the debt situation. But then African countries should continue to invest in the productive sectors of the economy, because the more we produce, perhaps the better our chances are. But again, we need to look at things a bit more globally. We are in a global trading system. that doesn't favor African countries very much. We are faced with unfair trade subsidies that make our produce and our exports not that competitive. If I can cite an example, until recently, it would be easier for a West African country to import beef and dairy products from Holland or from OECD countries than to import them from, let's say, next door in Mali. That is because farmers outside the continent face or are privileged, that they have access to subsidies that remain unfair for African producers. So for us to be able to get out of this debt cycle, we should be able to produce that and trade globally fairly as well. And secondly, we need financing that is concessional. And the scale should be sufficiently large. I think that is one way of addressing the debt situation. And I do hope our partners will be listening to us, because that is basically what speakers and presenters at this conference are talking about.
So if I had to summarize what you said, you advocate for African solutions to African problems, right?
Well, fair solutions to African problems. I would put it that way.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. TOURAY, for answering Africa 24's question.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.
It was a pleasure to have you with us on Africa 24 for this edition of the interview. Please stay tuned to our programs.
Bye.